What if everything you were taught about the Sabbath was only half the story? Most people know that Jesus kept the Sabbath, but when I started digging into what the Sabbath actually looked like in Jesus' time, the sounds, the rules, the debates, the arguments in the streets, I found three facts that completely changed how I read the Gospels. And the third one? Almost no one talks about it. To understand Jesus, you have to understand His world. And His world revolved around one day above all others, the Sabbath. From sunset on Friday to sunset on Saturday, everything stopped. The markets closed, the fires went out, the roads emptied, and millions of Jewish people across Israel and across the Roman Empire entered into a sacred rhythm that had been practiced for over 1,000 years. But here's what most of us miss. The Sabbath in Jesus' time wasn't just a quiet day of rest. It was the center of a massive, ongoing theological debate, and Jesus walked right into the middle of it, on purpose. I spent weeks going through ancient Jewish texts, archaeological records, and New Testament scholarship to understand what the Sabbath really looked like from the inside. What I found will change how you read every single Sabbath story in the Gospels. Let's start with the first surprising fact. Fact number 1, by the time Jesus was born, the Sabbath had 39 official categories of forbidden work and hundreds of sub-rules underneath each one. Most of us grew up hearing no work on the Sabbath. Simple, right? But the religious leaders of Jesus' day had spent centuries defining exactly what work meant. And the result was a system so detailed, it would surprise you. These 39 categories, called the Melachot, came from rabbinic tradition, and they covered everything from plowing and harvesting to writing and starting a fire. You couldn't carry an object from a private space to a public space. You couldn't walk more than what was called a Sabbath day's journey, roughly half a mile, from your home. Now, here's where it gets fascinating. The debates around these rules were intense. Scholars argue to this day about how strictly the average person in Galilee followed them. The Pharisees in Jerusalem had one interpretation. The Essenes, the community that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, had an even stricter one. And ordinary fishermen and farmers in Galilee? Probably somewhere in between. So when Jesus healed on the Sabbath, when He told the man with the withered hand to stretch it out, when He told the paralyzed man to pick up his mat, He wasn't just breaking a simple rule. He was entering a live, heated theological conversation that every Jewish person around Him understood immediately. The crowd wasn't just shocked. They knew exactly what was at stake. To them, Jesus wasn't just being careless. He was making a claim about who had the authority to define the Sabbath. Fact number 2, Jesus didn't reject Sabbath theology. He argued within it, like a rabbi who knew every rule better than the ones enforcing them. This one surprised me the most during my research. We often imagine the confrontations between Jesus and the Pharisees as Jesus simply dismissing their rules. But when you read the original Greek of the Gospels and compare it to what we know about first-century rabbinic debate methods, something different emerges. Jesus used a classic rabbinical technique called kal v'chomer, light and heavy argumentation. It works like this. If something is true in a minor case, how much more true must it be in a major case? In Matthew the 12, when confronted about healing on the Sabbath, Jesus says, "If any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep?" That's not a rejection of their legal framework. That's Jesus beating them at their own game. Every Pharisee in that room would have recognized that argument immediately. It's the kind of thing great rabbis said. And in the same confrontation, recorded in Luke the 13, when Jesus heals a woman who had been crippled for 18 years, he calls her a daughter of Abraham. That phrase carries enormous theological weight. He's not just healing her. He's declaring that her liberation is precisely what the Sabbath was meant to be about. The Sabbath, in the Hebrew Bible, is connected to freedom, to the Exodus from Egypt, to the idea that even slaves and animals deserved one day of rest. Jesus wasn't attacking the Sabbath. He was reclaiming its original meaning. And he said something in that same passage that makes this unmistakably clear. Should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day from what bound her? Set free on the Sabbath. That's not coincidence. That's theology. But the most surprising fact, the one I almost didn't include because I thought people wouldn't believe it, is fact number 3. Fact number 3, in Jesus' time, the Sabbath was not just a religious observance. It was an act of political and cultural resistance. Here's the context most Christians never hear. Israel was under Roman occupation. Rome was everywhere. The soldiers, the taxes, the emperor's image on every coin. And Rome had a word for people who didn't participate in the imperial economy: troublemakers. Jewish people didn't work on the Sabbath. They didn't pay taxes on the Sabbath. They didn't trade in Roman markets on the Sabbath. And Rome, somewhat surprisingly, had to tolerate it. The Romans had a complex relationship with Jewish religious practices. In some periods, they granted exemptions to Jewish soldiers from serving on the Sabbath. In others, enemies of Israel deliberately chose to attack on the Sabbath, knowing the people would be less likely to defend themselves. Imagen de Maccabees, batalhas do século III facund, ehi Christ. In fact, this had happened before Jesus was born. The books of the Maccabees record Jewish soldiers who died rather than fight on the Sabbath, and the crisis this caused within the community about whether self-defense was permitted. So, when Jesus walked into a synagogue on the Sabbath, in front of crowds that included ordinary people crushed by Roman taxation, people who had watched family members taken as slaves, people who were waiting for the Messiah to come and set Israel free, his actions carried political weight, whether he intended it or not. When he healed someone, when he declared that the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, when he said that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, these weren't just theological statements. They were declarations about power, about who was truly in charge of time itself. The Sabbath, in the Jewish imagination, pointed forward to something called the world to come, the Olam Haba, a future age of total rest and divine peace. Every Sabbath was a small taste of that future reality. And Jesus, by claiming authority over the Sabbath, was making an unmistakable claim that the future age had already begun to arrive in him. That's why the opposition to Jesus intensified every time he acted on the Sabbath. It wasn't just that he was breaking a rule, it was that he was claiming to be the fulfillment of everything the Sabbath pointed to. So here's what I walked away with after weeks of digging into this. The Sabbath in Jesus' world wasn't a dusty religious regulation. It was alive. It was contested. It was political. It was prophetic. And it was personal. Every time Jesus healed on the Sabbath, he wasn't being rebellious for the sake of it. He was revealing something about the nature of God, a God who doesn't postpone mercy until a more convenient day, a God for whom the liberation of a single suffering person is more important than any legal debate. And every time his enemies tried to trap him over Sabbath rules, They were asking a question that still echoes today. Who gets to define what is sacred? Jesus answered that question not with an argument, but with a healing. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you something. Which of these three facts surprised you the most? The 39 categories of forbidden work, the way Jesus argued as a rabbi, or the political dimension of the Sabbath under Roman occupation? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this video changed how you see Jesus, even slightly, share it with one person who loves the Bible, because the stories we think we know are often the ones with the most left to discover. See you in the next investigation.